Welcome everyone. My name is Gemma Baxter and at the MAVlab here I'm the Innovation Program Manager. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this MAVlab Innovation Talks event. If you haven't joined us, this series hopes to act a little bit like innovation acupuncture. So we convene Victorian councils in the local government sector to share learnings and scale up some of the incredible work you're doing. And we really don't have to look far to identify some really fantastic case studies. Now, to begin this event, on behalf of the Municipal Association of Victoria, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're gathering on. Up in Preston here, I'm on the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land, and I'd love to offer my respects to elders past and present. And I also want to recognise the connection that traditional owners all across Victoria have with lands, waters and communities. And I want to acknowledge the stories, traditions, cultures and aspirations of those First Peoples who forge the path ahead for emerging leaders. So please, if you feel comfortable, share where you're joining us from tonight. That could be in Victoria and beyond. I want to acknowledge that we are recording, as I've said just before hitting record there. So please stay with us if you can with your beautiful faces. We have an exciting program for 2026. This is the third of the year. Next month, we're doing one called Health as a Design Outcome, spotlighting tools for thriving neighbourhoods and homes. So I will pop the link in the chat. A very quick shout out for the MAVlab Innovation Awards. This is an awards program that launched last Thursday. Whoop, whoop. And we've got 13 exciting and really unique and fun categories, from the Dollars and Cents Award to the Community Voice Award to the Resilient Infrastructure Award. And we really encourage you, whether you're in council or whether you work with councils or know of council doing great work, please nominate, tap someone on the shoulder. We want to celebrate incredible work in our local government sector. And with that, I would like to pass over to my excellent colleague, Bonnie Shaw, to introduce us to tonight's event and why you're here with us.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Hello, everybody. Some of my favourite people. I can see many friendly faces already. All right, today we are here to talk about weathering the future local leadership in climate resilience. To set the scene, Australia's weather-related disasters are becoming more frequent, more intense and more costly, placing growing pressures on communities, local roads, community infrastructure and all sorts of essential services. Since January 2015, Victoria has had 90 declared disaster events, with many councils impacted multiple times over. Even the period just between October 2025 and January 2026 this year, catastrophic conditions were declared across 4 weather districts and more than 436,000 hectares of land were burnt, with a loss of over 1,590 structures across regional Victoria. Really significant crises yet again. Local government sits at the front line of this crisis alongside their communities. Councils are custodians of over $140 billion in shared community assets, many of which were not designed for the scale or frequency of the climate impacts that are now being experienced. Many of them are at the end of their life cycle and are facing significant challenges around maintenance. Integrating climate risk into infrastructure planning and emergency management and land use and community health is no longer optional. It is critical to ensuring communities remain safe and connected and able to thrive. So when policy frameworks and long-term strategies continue to evolve, councils need practical approaches right now. Pricing in future risk, joining the dots between spatial health and climate planning, using scenario-based approaches alongside kind of critical acute response can help local governments make better decisions today that will stand up over decades. Done well, climate and disaster resilience planning can protect public investment, it can strengthen social cohesion, and it can support economic stability through periods of disruption. So tonight, we're going to hear from some extraordinary people that are leading this work in local governments in councils across Victoria. First, we're going to hear from the City of Greater Bendigo about embedding climate change and emergency management through co-design and strengthened internal ways of working, those critical functions that make this work happen in an efficient way inside organisations. Next, we'll hear from some wonderful people from Bass Coast Shire, as they share insights into the energy resilient community hubs and how collaboration is building regional resilience in their local areas. Today, we are also joined by our wonderful MAV colleague, Jana Kujak, who is the Climate Futures and Resilience Lead at the MAV, where Jana leads a broad portfolio focused on climate adaptation, mitigation and resilience, particularly focusing at the moment around coastal adaptation and renewable energy, and of course the critical work around disaster and risk reduction, particularly over this last summer when Jana was leading the coordination of the MAV's High Risk Weather Response Task Force. Together, we will explore tonight how councils can lead with foresight and collaborate across boundaries and work functions and weather the future together with confidence. So we're going to start with Michelle Wyatt. Michelle, if you can get yourself ready. Michelle is the Manager of Climate Change and Environment at the City of Greater Bendigo, where she has worked with the local government sector for over 20 years in the environment and land use planning roles. She's currently the Manager of Climate Change and Environment at the City of Greater Bendigo, where she leads a team that brings together the organisation's emission reduction, biodiversity, climate resilience and emergency management functions, quite a broad and diverse portfolio. Michelle is committed to supporting community-led engagement processes that empower communities to act on climate change and to build their resilience. Michelle, please take it away.
Thank you very much. You can see and hear me all right? Just give you some, yeah, great. So thanks for having me on board. I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging and recognise their continuing connection to country. So I thought I would start with an overview, a bit of a summary of Bendigo. Who are we? As I mentioned, we're on Dja Dja Wurrung country and we have some Tanarung country in our municipality as well. As a snapshot, we've got about 125,000 people currently. That's growing rapidly and we're expecting to have about 172,000 people by 2046 and 200,000 by 2050. We often think of ourselves as a city in a forest, or we talk about ourselves as such. So the city of Greater Bendigo, the actual urban area, is surrounded by state and national parks, which creates an environment which is, I guess, a higher risk than some other areas, with topography that is flood prone, but also fire prone. We've got a vulnerable population, relatively high levels of disability in the community, relatively high levels of disadvantage and low-income households that struggle to get by. So the context of the community is they're definitely high capacity community members too, but a percentage that is a bit more vulnerable than others. In terms of the climate future for Bendigo, like most places, we know that daily temperatures are going to be increasing over time. We're going to have more days over 35. We're predicting 3 times as many days over 37 by 2050. And that was really felt this last summer when we had significant heat wave of 5 or 6 days over 40, like a lot of Victoria. And the fire season, it's now much longer than it used to be. So we talk about the higher danger season rather than the high risk season. It's a higher risk season lasting from October to April. So any time during that period, we could experience fire if the conditions are right. This is just a snapshot of the recent climate events that have occurred in Bendigo since my time with the city. I've been with the city since 21. We've had floods in 2022, flash flooding. We had a storm and hail in 23, and then again a really large scale rain event in January 24, which affected other parts of the state. This was extraordinary amounts of rain in a very short period of time, which had a significant impact on our residents. 153 dwellings were inundated. We had, we've got the exact number of requests there, but 4,600 requests for assistance or road closures, and a really difficult time for the community. Many roads were damaged, and as you can see, a lot of the community were impacted across the whole municipality. It wasn't isolated to one area. It was really spread across a large part of the municipality, from Heathcote all the way to Goonong. Then we had some storms in the February after that. We had our relief centre on standby for that, but that was due to fire danger, not so much the storms. So we had floods and fires in very quick succession, and then a very dry winter in 25, and drought support was provided through Agriculture Victoria, but a lot of our farming community were experiencing very high prices for hay and feed, and very low levels in their dams. So again, a difficult period. And then the most recent heat wave over summer in January, and the Harcourt fire, although it didn't extend into Bendigo, we provided support to our neighbouring council, Mount Alexander, and operated a relief centre for people needing to evacuate. And a lot of our community were sent those evacuation notices, warnings as well, in anticipation of the fire spreading. Just trying to move on. Hopefully, there we go. So in response, I think our team structure can help explain the emphasis in our response. There's lots of ways to structure an organisation like local government. In our case, my team, which is the Climate and Environment Unit, sits within Healthy Communities and Environment, so sits with all the teams that do community development and capacity building and service provision, which is, in my experience, unusual for local government, but it's been working quite well because it gives us a community-centred approach and community-centred approach to our work. And within my team, we've got emergency management and resilience, and climate action and the natural environment functions. And that just means that when funding is available or programs are proposed relating to climate adaptation, it's quite easy for us to respond because we've got our climate team and our emergency management resilience team working so closely together. And it provides a real home for that climate adaptation function within the organisation, and has been able to elevate the importance of a climate response within the organisation. We also are part of a cluster of councils here in northern Victoria. So we work collaboratively with our neighbouring councils on our emergency planning and support each other with the response and resilience building. And we only see that partnership growing so that Bendigo so that we're working collaboratively and sharing resources and being more efficient with how we do our emergency planning. So that might come back, the benefit of having the climate action, our emissions reduction team with our emergency management resilience team, may come back into the presentation later. In terms of our immediate response, we did all the things that everybody does immediately after our 2024 floods, which was our most significant event in recent history. We engaged with our communities. We did drop-in sessions. We had a blaze aid function. We engaged with community members directly. We responded to all the inquiries and sent out, worked with other agencies to send out grocery vouchers, etc. So all of that in the immediate aftermath was done in a very normal, traditional recovery way. But since then, we had recovery funding, and we happened to have some Emergency Management Victoria funding to work on climate resilience in particular. We combined those two buckets of money and delivered a program that is helping to take our communities from the flood, from the event, through recovery, and then through a continuum to resilience. So we see our work with the flood-affected communities as a part of a continuum to help build their resilience. So in the immediate aftermath of the floods, we had all the urgent repairs, the relief, waste disposal, all of those things that you normally have. We then went into recovery of fixing our drains and, providing support to our community around insurance and social support. They were in a state of loss and trauma. So we were concerned about their immediate well-being and had programs to support them with that. And then many communities started pretty quickly to start talking about, well, what do we do better next time, and how can we have better plans in place? How can we support each other as a community? They talked about what kind of relief centres do they need or want, sandbagging actions, how can they help their neighbours? And we talked a lot about waterway planning, because a lot of the flash flooding occurred through our waterways, our urban waterways. And ended up getting some external funding to do some waterway flood mitigation project work, which is still underway. But then we moved with some communities through into the next stage. And again, it wasn't hard for communities to connect what had happened at the floods with the climate changing. And many communities wanted to start having discussions around climate resilience more broadly and other hazards. So we've been working with some communities on a community-led workshopping process to help them understand how do they respond to extreme heat, how are they going to support their communities through fire events or catastrophic days again. And that work is still in progress. And then I guess the final stage will be when they take action and have the community connections in place and the social supports. And I guess this continuum just emphasises how social capital and community connections is so foundational to successful recovery and successful resilience. So thinking about emergency management as separated from community development is not helpful, and they do really need to be thought about as combined functions. And I guess symbiotic functions. We do find that some communities think like they sometimes talk about being in a space of resilience, but when you actually unpick a few threads, it turns out that there's still a lot of trauma in their communities, in their worlds, and they go back and talk about drains and blockages. And we recently experienced that, where we had some workshops and thought the community was ready to talk about other hazards and have a future focus, but really they were stuck at this drain hadn't been unblocked, that culvert still needed to be upgraded, what's happening to this bridge? And we found that we really hadn't done as good a job of addressing some of those concerns as we could have. So as it happens, this is for me, one of several webinars we'll be delivering over the next few weeks. We'll be doing a series of webinars on drainage and flooding to tell our community what we have been doing, what is planned, what flood planning and flood mitigation actions we're taking and have taken over the recent past. So our program was place-based. We've been working specifically with 4 communities on recovery and around 6 communities on resilience. But it also has had a population group focus, where we've also worked with called communities through our Bendigo Community Health Service. We've been working with people with disability on people-centred planning. We've provided funding to our traditional owner group, JARA, to support their initial discussions with their members on what does climate resilience mean to them. And we work with young people on design of the Disasters and Ladders games and a bunch of other initiatives to engage them in the emergency planning space. So I actually don't know how much time I've got left, so just let me know if I'm running over, but I've got 2 more slides. This is on the challenges. Thanks. This is on the challenges that we faced along the way and that we continue to face. Closing the loop, it is such an important part of the process. After an emergency event, it's the easiest thing to promise something. We'll investigate this, we'll consider that, we'll talk to that agency about fixing that other thing. But if you don't go back and tell the community what happened, then they will never be able to move forward into planning and resilience. The community politics is always challenging. Communities are not one person, they're multiple people. They all have different they all have different interests, and sometimes navigating that process is challenging. Of course, reaching everyone is always difficult. The difficult to reach people in the community are difficult to reach for a reason, and we've become quite aware recently that not everybody is connected to social media and Facebook. We can't only promote things through those channels, and really have to sometimes be a bit more analog with our communication methods, and just send out letters and go and talk to people. We've had real challenges with short-term incident-based funding. We've had a jigsaw puzzle of funding that we've been trying to put together to deliver a cohesive climate resilience community-led program. But reporting on that is difficult. Getting approval for all the bits and pieces through the funders is difficult. And I dream of a world where we have funding for climate resilience rather than for fire prevention, or for drought support, or for flood recovery. Supporting the community to move past their trauma is always hard, as I said. Even when we think that they've moved on, they quickly go back to that drain, my experience, all of my things were lost, etc., etc. Or my neighbour was trapped and couldn't get out of their street, and it all comes back when you start talking about it again. And managing community expectations, I think a lot of communities, and this won't be unfamiliar to most other councils, a lot of communities really have high expectations for local government to protect them and to flood-proof them or fire-proof them. And we've been slowly trying to engage our community and talk to them about the limits of councils and government's ability to control the weather and the natural environment and the environment around them, and the things we can do and then the things that we can't do. And that's where our capacity to affect change stops. That's where the communities, there's a need for the community to think about how they can be better prepared and support each other. And then I guess the success factors of any program that as we continue to roll out our current program and think about new programs, it's all fairly simple. I wouldn't say it's particularly innovative, but we do need to be continuously communicating with our communities, reporting back, involving them, genuinely taking a community-led approach by devolving some of our responsibility and our decision-making to communities where that's possible, and making sure that we continue to keep them in the loop with things as they progress. Internal cross-functional working groups, really critical, because we've had to work really closely with our engineering teams who are responsible for drainage and flooding, and our planning teams who are responsible for flood planning as well. Making sure that we're all on the same page and supporting each other has been important. Investing in community leadership so that they can continue the journey and make sure that they feel equipped to take their communities through a planning and resilience process. And as I said, building social connections and networks. Our interagency relationships, we're really lucky to have really strong relationships with North Central Catchment Management Authority, Collaburn Water, and others who have been critical to telling a cohesive story about who can do what when, and how we are actually working together. Sometimes the actual working together is easier to say than to do, but we're all committed to it, which is what's important. And resisting bureaucratic processes. We always have so many barriers to taking action in the local government land, and I'm always interested in how we can reduce those, reduce the processes the community needs to go through to get an answer or to take action themselves as a community, and just trying to unblock the blockages and delegalize the legal speak that can often creep into our processes. So that's all I had from the slides. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Thank you, Michelle. That was fantastic, and hit across so many of the systemic challenges that councils face, both working in communities in this area as well as the sort of interesting tensions that arise internally. How long has that structure been in place?
The Climate Change and Environment team was created in 21, just before I started, and the emergency management resilience function came into that team in 23, I think, or 24, I can't remember, but it's been like that for 2.5 years or so. And I guess I have bias because I lead that team, but I feel that it's really worked well for both our climate action and our emergency management teams, and broadens our emergency management teams, I guess, lens and area of focus, and gives them the license to extend their thinking beyond individual hazards.
Yeah, more systemic challenges. The kind of surge and retreat of crisis is obviously compounding and becoming more frequent. But with that team, are you seeing more of a stitching together? I heard you talk about kind of more frequent communications and building literacy in your community around change. Like, are you sort of seeing that surge of crisis connect more deeply into and the kind of heightened community response sort of smooth out through some of those other times as well?
And I feel like even though it's been 2 years since the 2024 floods when we started this work, it feels sometimes like it's still early days with building capacity in our communities. Some communities are much more cohesive and forward-thinking and are able to smooth out those bumps, I guess, more than others. And that's partly reflecting the social capital and connections in those communities. We have some communities that were heavily flood affected, but are more fragmented, less obvious community leadership, and just a bit of difference between old and new, and those sort of fractures. And there's less cohesiveness in those communities, and they've struggled to find the spaces to support each other and identify what they need as a community. And that's partly because they don't have as strong a community identity. And that's probably more so in some of the the more urban parts of Bendigo. So that's been, so I think it's really varied. One of the things we're conscious of is our team trying to be a place of providing continuity and making sure that our resources provide continuity for the community in between events, and so that's securing resources to make sure we've got a continuous ongoing function to continue this work so that we're not in and out.
Very good. One more question before we move on to our other council. You talked about the need to kind of communicate in this growing complexity and sort of bring your community along with the changes that are inherent in sort of the increased impact on infrastructure related to climate events. How are you thinking about storytelling in your work?
Well, I think we could be doing storytelling a little bit better, and I'm hoping that these upcoming webinars will be able to at least start to tell the story of flooding in different localities in a bit more of a plain English way. I think it's interesting bringing together the disciplines of engineering and recovery and resilience teams. The language is very different, and the community doesn't always understand even when we think that they do. And so I am interested in how we can use more simple, plain English without dumbing down information, and while still providing accurate information. And that's probably the tension, to provide accurate information that is still comprehensible. So I would say that we are still working on that. And if anyone's got a good example of how they've done it, that I'd love to see it.
Oh, I challenge that. I challenge the group to start dropping in resources and case studies about great storytelling in really complex, highly technical scenarios. I can think of a couple that I'll throw in too. Thank you. We're going to now introduce our two new speakers who are going to share some of their great insights, and then we'll bring Michelle back and we'll have a chat at the end. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce two of, I think, are some of the busiest people in council, both from Bass Coast Shire Council. Try and say that 10 times fast. First, let me introduce the wonderful Nick Grant-Collins. Nick is the Coordinator of Community Safety and Resilience at the Bass Coast Shire Council and Chair of the Gippsland Regional Emergency Management Committee. Nick is the leader in emergency management and social impact. He currently heads up the emergency management, community safety and compliance teams at Bass Coast. He also leads strategic portfolios in homelessness and affordable housing, bringing a strong commitment to community resilience and equity, and kind of very different portfolio, but kind of mirroring this really interesting diversity of areas that Michelle raised as well. Nick's career in Australia spans local and state government roles across emergency management, health planning, diversity and inclusion, child safety, smart cities, and housing. He currently serves as the chair of the Gippsland Regional Emergency Management Planning Committee and is committed to supporting community-led innovation and fostering partnerships that deliver practical and inclusive outcomes. Nick is also joined by Simon Woodland. Simon is the Manager of Sustainable Environment at Bass Coast Shire Council and also President of SECCCA, which is the South East Council's Climate Change Alliance. And Simon is passionate about helping human communities navigate their relationship with the natural world. Through a career in local government spanning over 20 years in urban, peri-urban and regional settings, Simon works to foster environmental stewardship, ecological identity and inclusive community decision-making. As the Manager of Sustainable Environment at Bass Coast, his current portfolio includes overseeing delivery of Bass Coast's ambitious climate action plan, as well as waste services, biodiversity, integrated water management, sustainability, and coastal adaptation. So these two, I think, are some of the hardest working people in councils in Victoria. And it is my pleasure to introduce them as they share some of the incredible work that they are doing. Take it away, fellas.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'm going to kick off and then throw over to Nick, because we thought what we'd do is tell you a little bit about where this work came from and what we thought we were going to do when we initially embarked in our climate journey, climate adaptation plan journey, that is. And then we'll talk to you about what actually happened, because there's nothing quite like a plan to give you somewhere to depart from when reality strikes. So without further ado, you see my screen all right, everyone? Yep. So Bass Coast Shire declared a climate emergency in 2019, and that was off the back of some really strong community advocacy. So it was very much a community-led plan. It meant we were one of the first regional Victorian councils to do so. And we ended up with a plan that council hosts, but really it reflects what the community can do and the targets and aspirations the community has for itself, as much as a plan council needs to deliver for council's operations. So it includes actions for households, it includes actions for businesses and farm managers, but it also includes 15 actions council will take within its own operations and 30 actions that council will take to support the community. And that was endorsed in 2020. And even then we knew that we were going to, that we were experiencing all these climate change hazards, including increased temperature and more severe storms. What we didn't know was when they were going to strike and where, and how soon, and how, very much like Michelle's presentation, how much of a cascading cumulative impact they were going to have. So for example, one of the very first actions in the list for council to deliver in order to support the community spoke about supporting the development of local climate resilience centres. And I don't know if any of you have ever inherited carriage of a plan with this much detail in it, but it's amazing how quickly people lose track of what exactly did we mean by that? Was that an educational focus? You might be reading this on the screen if you can squint that well. Some people saw it as something we would do to really demonstrate technologies and inspire people to take action. Some people thought of it more as a resilience measure. So bear that in mind. what actually happened was we took an opportunity through some Sustainability Victoria funding, having implemented a whole bunch of solar on our community facilities, we decided to start installing batteries. So fast forward to 2025, and we conducted a midterm review which identified that we'd actually made really good progress. We'd exceeded the target that we'd set ourselves of 250 kilowatts of solar. We'd actually already installed, in less than 5 years, we'd installed over 300 kilowatts of rooftop solar. I know if there's any urban councils on the call, they'll be like, what's that even? That's nothing. But in a rural area, that's huge. And we'd also installed 120 kilowatt hours of batteries by last year, which weren't even in the mix in 2020. We didn't even imagine they would become available and affordable. However, if we zoom back 1 year to 2024, to 2022, we go back to 2022, we installed our first battery at a community centre in the Waterline community in Coronella, thinking that if there were batteries there to complement the power system at a community facility, then wouldn't that be a resilient place, provide some energy security for that community? Little did we know that within a blink of an eye, a storm struck that exact community. So I'd love to think that it was brilliant planning on our part. It was part luck, but it proved to be a really great proof of concept for this idea. And from there, the broader project was born, I suppose, and I'll throw over to Nick because his team really lent in and partnered. So my team in the sustainability space, sort of the solar panel people, if you want to call it that. Nick's team were really the emergency and the social capital kind of piece, and it's the marriage of those two that really, I think, took this project and gave it wings.
Thanks so much, Simon. And one of the things that Simon and I talked about in the context of this conversation is, when did this become an innovation piece, right? Because before the February storms, it was probably a BAU energy resilience piece that was great, right? And was going to deliver some hubs. And as you pointed to, Simon, there's resilience, and resilience hubs are a capacious term in a way that can be both enabling and confounding. But that was really a leverage moment when what had been installed at Coronella, we'd since worked across the two functions to put in a funding bid to EMV to do a few more sites. And then when the storms hit, obviously really powerful proof of concept in Coronella, not just for the physical infrastructure, but for what became that real kernel of community-led planning and activation that kind of breathed life into this. But what it meant is that when AusNet then came in after the storms with a level of funding that local government doesn't usually have access to in this space, we very much were able to approach them early with a shovel-ready delivery model and tiered site prioritization that had already been done based on disaster risk exposure, but also from Simon's lens, BAU climate change impact, because I think we all know that we can and should do these hubs in local communities where there's need, but it might be 4 years until they're impacted by another event. It might not. So these were sites that delivered, again, that BAU climate change impact. We prioritized sites where community services were operating out of to kind of amplify that impact. And we're able to approach AusNet essentially saying, here's our long list of sites, here's the delivery model, we're ready to go. And involve those community groups. And I think one of the things we really wanted to showcase is, we can split up the portfolios internally, but a lot of the community groups that we're engaging with from a climate change lens over here and a disaster preparedness lens over here are actually the same 30 people, right? We just approach them through different ways from council. So I think leveraging that engagement from the beginning was key. Next slide, Mr. Woodland, please. So obviously, we're able to unlock a lot of funding and deliver, again, go from a few sites to deliver a real ecosystem, if you will, of 10 sites across the municipality. And what you can see is a snip from our emergency dashboard where you see all the 10 community hubs there. So huge kind of funding for council, but I think what we ended up being more excited about is that network of community groups, within the concentric circles of these different sites, they actually applied directly and were successful in over 240,000 funding for 9 community-led projects. I was going to take the list out, but actually left it in because I love the diversity of those groups. So you have local life-saving clubs, you have rec reserve committees, you have community centers, Mycelia, which is very much a climate change group, all under the sign of disaster resilience, kind of accessing and amplifying this funding pool. And then, taking those steps, not just to sort of hold that like we do with emergency relief centers for good reason. We hold that information and publish it, when relevant, taking that step to make it visible to community where these hubs are, with the various caveats around activation.
I might jump in there, Nick,
please.
and just point out for those who don't know Bass Coast, none of these hubs are big, fancy, showy facilities. They're actually really very basic community facilities that just happen to be down the road or in the middle of a regional town. They're places people sometimes don't even know that is there because they're not used to accessing our services. But when we say proof of concept, the power went out in Coronella from that one storm in February 2024. It didn't come back on again for 5 days in that region. And so day after day, and it's easy to say that in hindsight, but people had no clue when it was going to come back on. There were no comms, there were no phones. And so day after day, more and more people started noticing that there were lights on at the community centre, rocking up, finding that there were people there they could talk to, get a hug from, charge their phone, get the latest information, even before council stepped in or was able to get there with official kind of, emergency management resources. That community just went, oh, hang on a minute, our lights are working, our power's working, let's open the doors and put on a cup of tea. And that's what we mean by proof of concept. It was organic, which is brilliant.
Absolutely. And so as Michelle touched on, the hard infrastructure is absolutely critical, but I think we know that the social infrastructure as operating system is really what sits behind this and has that permanence. But installing the hard infrastructure is a really enabling kind of convening act in these communities. So we were able to, around Coronel and that initial response, set up a waterline. So that set of communities we call the waterline, a waterline emergency network, which has been really active. There's a picture there of them launching their own community messaging or preparedness guide with AusNet. And that's essentially become the model for these sort of multi-township community networks now across Phillip Island, across Cape Patterson. And again, taking that step to give those communities the sort of trust of government to self-activate at these sites. So what we've seen is they self-activate as cooler places. The members of these networks have fobs to get into the buildings when there's an event, and that really, pushed the risk appetite of some departments, and those were really powerful discussions. And I think, again, there's an internal sense that if we had tried to do that separately, I think might not have got there, but the sort of, the force of the strategic alignment across climate change. And really, I think those of us in the emergency management sector know that community-led is oft said, but sometimes government has trouble letting go a little bit. But these have been sites where we have community groups that, have the ability to self-activate, and we've seen that, and that delivers value to interagency planning in so many ways, right? It helps our resourcing, it allows them to activate based on needs. And what we've seen is they've then taken on that role of facilitating their own debriefs, right? And taking responsibility, not just for response, but for preparedness and that sort of recovery and resilience piece. So that's where that more larger and complex benefit starts to accumulate. And just in terms of some learnings and provocations, right? Because I think there's so many on this call who have done great work in this space. I think we've been able to leverage a bit of scale in Bass Coast and sort of hit something that covers off the whole municipality. And in so doing, go back through the eye of the needle of what really sort of a bit of a brave community-led approach would look like. So I think the first learning is to have that site prioritization done and ready and to really look at it from that cross-functional climate change plus emergency management to solve for different use cases there, because obviously we don't know when the next event or when the next funding stream, and as you pointed out, Michelle, the funding streams are often fractured and random and post facto. And I think a lot of times there's a scramble to do the prioritization work in the moment when that can be done. And then, especially when it's the private sector wanting to play with us, being able to give them that confidence in a delivery model. And I think with those community groups, seek alignment, but not control. That's been a big thing for us. And again, seeing the amount of community groups that themselves applied for the funding to deliver on essentially the strategies that you put up on the screen, Simon. Again, just the power of that hard infrastructure, unlocking the social capital and the interdependencies there, push for that true community-led approach. And I think, again, we're all really comfortable with the argument that we underinvest in prevention and overinvest in response, and the ROI is 3-to-1 or 12-to-1, depending on how you do the math. But I think really brief up exec and councillors about the why, and then have a pretty clear runway. My favorite provocations at the moment is risk assessment, and I think a lot of us know that in the compound disaster space, some of the tools we have with Zero, we're sort of hammering a square peg into a round hole. And can we take a lot of these demonstration projects that we've delivered and weave them back through how we assess and talk about risk? And another one is, this was a moment in time where there were $10 million in the sector for these kind of projects, and something we've talked about a lot in Gippsland. The real risk or the opportunity cost would be to be left with a bunch of cool infrastructure pieces that don't add up to something systemic in terms of activation protocol, how we, use this at a regional and state level. So I think there's a challenge there. And I can't believe Simon got through his part without saying the word adaptation, which is his his trademark. But I think it's as Gemma and Bonnie, as you've really convened us to think about, climate change, adaptation plus mitigation is disaster resilience, is adaptation, is disaster resilience, and really trying to not only weave that internally, but one of the things that will change in Bass Coast over the next months is like you said, a review of that climate change action plan has been done, and we'll integrate some of our emergency resilience content into a community-facing climate change portal that essentially brings those use cases together in one kind of capacity building set of resources, so that those who can, right, and that's where the sort of resilient building council, hardening private assets can use those, and then the subsidy, the focus of us and response agencies can really go to those that need it most.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Bonnie. I think that's us.
Amazing work. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing a really inspiring process. I'm interested. I'm gonna dive straight into the bit that I'm most interested in, because I hold the mic right now. The piece around shared governance, and sort of council stepping back from control, and building those relationships of trust that allow the space for community leadership within kind of shared council community environments. Please tell us the secret sauce.
Can I jump in quickly, Nick? Because Nick's got the on-ground expertise here, but I feel like in some ways this is actually getting easier, because council is realising that there's just no way we can. All the talk, there's no way we can deliver on the talk of empowering community and enabling this with the resources we have. We've got less and less resources every year. The only way actually is to invest in these relationships and to use these moments in time to build them to the next level. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is core business of, the climate change and sustainability teams. And I think, emergency management teams with that maybe legacy more of command and control just probably need to look at, how those climate change programs are run in partnership with community and replicate that, and I think it is really just about, I think leaning in to all the research, all the the intent around community led, and I think scale is always important, right? You're not going to achieve it in one fell swoop across the municipality. I think one township is usually too small, and it's sort of bringing the right amount of communities together to do local level planning, and having, I think we're really fortunate sometimes in regional communities to have, oftentimes emergency management team members are also in the CFA, in the SES, and I think there's risk around that we manage, but there's also something really wonderful and leverage in that, and so bringing those groups together and kind of linking them as networks of networks to achieve these greater things while allowing them to determine exactly what they want from the process.
Super interesting. You mentioned also the sort of catalytic effect of physical infrastructure to sort of feed endorse the social infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think the beauty of this is, as Nick was getting at, and Nick, that's the first time I've seen anyone put my word in writing independently. But the thing I love about this infrastructure was when we went to these groups initially to say, hey, we know you've got a solar array, or we'd like to put a solar array on your community building, but we'd also like to put a battery bank on, and here's how we'd like it to work. It reduces their bills from day one. It helps a cash-strapped community group that's trying to run on the smell of an oily rag to be sending less money offshore to some corporation that sends, pays, delivers some electricity. So it would be a good news story if never a storm struck Bass Coast again. You know what I mean? So it's mitigation, and it's cost of living, and it's, so you've got them from day one if you send the right person with the right story. The fact that it actually worked, I think, honestly, no one was probably more surprised than us that it actually, because the technology doesn't always deliver on the promise, right? But the fact that it just literally just clicked over and started powering this facility without any expert, fancy technicians involved, it was priceless. And we've had glitches since, but now that community, those groups and the hosts and owners of those sites, or the occupants of those sites, are owning that process too, and sort of getting in touch with us if they've got issues or need to update their user manual and things. So it's it's using the sexy technology, or the thrill of having your own solar array or whatever, as a way in to talk about actually much more complex social issues like community resilience and preparedness and the psychology of it all.
Did the kind of the sexy technology and the sort of innovation lens, do you think that kind of shifted some people's perspectives on it? It may, like, if you we sort of hear this story often where BAU or investing more in things that already work can feel a little tedious sometimes, but if you put that sort of little glitter of innovation across it, that can help to catch people's attention, get them a bit more excited, and draw them towards it. Did you notice that?
Yeah, and I think especially when, like, some of these facilities already run food hubs, for example, and they have quite substantial refrigeration. And, what's worse in a crisis than losing the contents of your fridge? It's if the local support group also lose the contents of their backup community support hub, fridge. So the fact that we can target that investment in a place where it doesn't just keep the lights on and power the kettle, but it actually keeps the emergency food supply or the backup food supply for vulnerable residents intact as well, and reduces their power bill. It's I think it wasn't hard to get their buy-in.
Yeah, and I think resilience is such a broad tent in a way, and I think one of the things it does is give disparate community groups a way in to this work. And I think lots of councils, you have, say, residents and ratepayers groups, which sometimes feel like a bit of an anachronism. What are we doing together? and I think this is something where some are there for the flashy technology, some are there for the granular social networking, some are there, because they have this structure that's ready to help the community, but it needs the right work. And I think in many ways, like back to that, what is putting something on the roof do? I think it kind of can reconvene these groups in new arrays that allow them to solve problems together rather than repeat the same conflicts that we're used to.
Yeah, very good. Michelle, can we pull you back in? And we're coming close to time, but if anyone does have questions, I know there's a stack of people on this call that have deep experience in this space as well. So if you do have questions or reflections, please put your hand up or throw any comments in the chat, and we can try and get to you now or later. My question for the three of you, so you're kind of dealing with crisis in sort of regional areas. What lessons do you think you have to share with some of the our colleagues that are working in areas that are maybe less prone to climate crisis in the same sort of acute surge sense, or have quite different dynamics in their communities? What can they pick up and learn from some of the experiences that you've had?
I'm happy to start. I mean, for us in Bendigo, we've got a urban centre, an urban population who maybe feels more protected from climate impacts than our rural community, who is more exposed. But that might be perception rather than reality. And I guess we are very conscious here, I'm sure everyone else is too, of just the impact that heat waves and extreme heat is going to have and on all community members across urban and rural populations. And we are trying to think about how we can send out the messaging about heatwave planning in the same way that we do about fire planning, having a fire plan. We would really love to see our community start to think about having an extreme heat plan, whether they live in the centre of Bendigo or out in a rural part, on a farm out in Maya or somewhere. I think everybody is exposed to climate risk, and I guess even in Melbourne, the not so long ago, 2022 was it, floods in Maribyrnong demonstrated that, right in the centre of Melbourne, and that sort of flash flooding could happen anywhere. That's another thing that we're quite conscious of, talking to our community about how the intensity of rainfall is changing and is becoming, it seems that it's so localized and difficult to predict. It could happen anywhere across urban or rural communities. So I think talking to your community about all of those risks that affect everybody is important, and think about having a plan. We talk a lot about have a plan for all scenario, all of these different hazards. I think is important.
For me, what's coming out of this for me is that I think that probably the single biggest indicator of successful recovery and resilience is the existing social capital, in local social capital, like within yelling or walking distance, if you want to put it that way. So I would say I think humans are terrible at imagining themselves ever having to deal with a disaster. So if you don't have the luxury of a current or recent catastrophe to build on, I would say start with a good news story like, would you like solar and batteries with that? Or whatever the relevant local option is. Something that brings people together, introduces three people to each other who don't know each other yet, and kind of build from there, because it's those, however amorphous and difficult to pin down they might be, it's those existing social networks that kick into gear. And people go, hang on a minute, I know the person 3 doors down, or I have set foot in that facility before and I can see the lights are on. I'm going to stick my nose in and see what's going on. It's those existing social networks actually that are the foundation for that response, that community-led response. So use whatever good or bad news story you've got going on in your community to start fostering those conversations, and try and get them to just ossify around, try and get those networks to not formalize to the level of local government, but become more robust and rigorous, I guess.
Yeah, very good. Nick, do you want to close us out?
Oh, look, I think one of the things that Sam and I've talked about is, is again the kind of premise of this talk is that partnership between sustainable environment and emergency management is really critical in so many ways, but also in terms of the permanence and the ambition of the work, right? We're in a phase now where maybe less people are talking about climate change and more are talking about resilience, and that was different a few years ago, and it'll change again, right? And rather than being sort of essentially stuck in those smaller loops around fashionable terminology and kind of macro politics, I think these two functions are really great partners, and building them together really ensures that, if one of the things that is a key enabler of innovation is kind of changing risk and then creating and authorizing an environment that allows you to see it through, I think bringing those two functions together is really enabling. And I think that's the way of the future, because when we talk about risk going forward, you're probably going to need those two.
Very good. All right, we're coming up on time. I have a final question for you, because some of this work is pretty heavy. A lot of this work is pretty heavy. It's a heavy load to lift, and you're working with communities that are experiencing significant trauma, and exhibiting a huge amount of strength and resilience themselves. How do you guys keep yourself going? How do you keep yourself safe and manage your own well-being? And my final kind of framing question is, what gives you hope and joy in this work? Michelle.
Just a quick, simple one.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go, Simon.
No, just.
Oh yeah, quick, yeah, simple question. Are we? I guess I'm more, conscious that my team is on the front line, working with these communities, and it can be really hard for them. So, giving them space and time and opportunities for their own, for their own personal time, I think is important, and reminding them that they don't have to put too much pressure on themselves. They don't have to solve all the problems, because it feels sometimes like you're presented with all the problems, and if that can be a heavy burden. But I guess sharing the burden is important, and for them to know that they're not responsible for everything. But it is hard. We also try and have a good laugh around the team, and make sure that people don't take everything too seriously. And what gives me hope? I'm a really optimistic person, so I have seen the communities after our 24 floods, one community that didn't really have much cohesiveness, slowly start to come together, think about the future, involve each other, get to know their neighbours. And actually, that's one of the nicest things, is when you're at a workshop and people start to connect with each other across the table, because they live next to, down the road. They didn't know that they both were affected, and they can share their stories. And I think if we can provide space for that, that's a nice feel.
That's awesome. Thank you. Simon?
Look, at the risk of zooming out too far, Bonnie, I think for me, I just take heart from the fact that if in the 200,000 or so years that we've been walking around this planet in our modern human form, if there's one thing we do, it's adapt. Like, we are such an incredibly adaptable species. We're next to useless on our own, but in cohesive groups, there doesn't appear to be anything we can't do. So, and the fact that we have a strong bias towards bad news. So just because nearly everything we hear is bad news doesn't mean that most of what's going on in the world is bad news. It's just that's what we like to focus our attention on for some reason. So I try and remind myself that, the magpies and the oak trees don't really notice or care. They're just getting on with things, so we can just get on with things too. The sun will come up tomorrow and we'll adapt.
Very good.
Together.
Absolutely. I think one of the things about emergency management is, of all the portfolios I've been in local government, it is probably the most relationship based and driven, and draw a lot of nourishment from that. And it brings you in contact with lots of really amazing people and lead agencies. And I actually think, it's funny, it's probably when I went to Bass Coast, it was the portfolio that I had the least background in. taken on. And I've come to the view that it is actually potentially the most innovative one. Like, there is so much open space in emergency management in terms of really operationalizing community-led and resilience, that it's a bit counterintuitive, because there is, of course, that command and control, and that's really important. But I actually think, especially, climate plus EM is hugely enabling space right now. So I think there's a lot of optimism in terms of, the work and the complexity that we want to engage with. Sometimes, it's hard to find the narrow path through it in other portfolios, but I think there's a lot of space in front of us.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing the incredible work that you do, for stepping into these crisis areas on a daily basis, for supporting the communities through these really challenging events, and for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure. And you've shared some incredible stories that I'm sure everyone in our community will be able to learn from, including the people that work directly in this space. But I think there is so much to learn from the practices that you guys are developing and deploying that can be taken into other areas of council as well. Thank you to everyone that's joined us tonight and that will be watching this online in the future. As always, thank you all so much for your service and for the incredible work that you do to support your communities every day. Signing off, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.